The morning was heavy and gray, the kind of silence that feels like it's holding its breath. A faint siren moaned from the distance, and then came the sound, the deep metallic groan of San Quentin's gate sliding open. Inside, time felt slower. The air was thick, and the smell of concrete, rust, and old paint clung to every wall. Elias Monroe stood by the bars of his cell, staring at nothing. 23 years had passed since the day he first stepped inside this place. His beard had gone gray around the edges, and his hands carried scars, some from fights, others from work in the prison shop. He didn't talk much anymore. Words didn't survive long here. Only silence did. Through the intercom, a voice echoed, "Cell Block D, prepare for transfer." The sound rolled through the halls like thunder. Everyone knew what it meant. Someone was going to the death chamber. Elias closed his eyes. Another name. Another number. Another man lost to the same machine that had swallowed him 2 decades ago. He whispered to himself, "Another one gone," then sat on his bunk, staring at the floor until the hallway quieted again. He wasn't always like this. Once, he'd been a man with a wife, a little girl, and a dream, a small auto repair shop in Oakland. Back then, his world smelled like motor oil and fresh bread from the bakery down the street. But one night changed everything. A robbery at a corner store. A man shot. No camera. No witnesses. Just fingerprints. His fingerprints, left behind from when he'd fixed the store's register a week earlier. They said it was enough. They said his car matched the one seen near the crime scene. They said a lot of things. But the truth didn't matter. The story was too neat to question. He remembered the courtroom like a photograph burned into his mind. The pale walls, the judge's calm face, the sound of the gavel. The sentence hit harder than any punch he'd ever taken. Life in prison. No parole. His mother collapsed in the gallery. His wife screamed his name. His daughter never looked up. San Quentin became his world. The first night was chaos, shouting, banging, the metallic slam of doors locking in rhythm. He was thrown into a cell with an older inmate named Reggie, a man with tired eyes and a voice like gravel. Reggie told him, "You either find peace in your head, or this place eats you alive." Elias didn't understand then, but it didn't take long. Days blurred together. Some men spent hours staring at walls. Others fought just to feel alive. Elias tried something different. He read. He taught himself law, wrote letters for men who couldn't spell, helped them appeal their cases. It gave him purpose, something small but real. But every time the lights flickered and the hum of electricity ran through the lower block, everyone froze. It was a sound that meant someone's time had come. He'd sit there, still as stone, listening. Because no matter how long you'd been inside, that sound never lost its weight. Then came the night the rain wouldn't stop. The storm outside was loud enough to drown out the usual noise of clanging and shouting. But when the cell doors opened early, Elias knew something was wrong. Guards rushed past without a word. The silence that followed was sharper than any scream. Whispers spread fast. "It's Daniels," someone muttered. "He's gone." Gone meant one thing, dead. Daniels had been Elias's closest friend in the block. A man who believed in hope, even here. He used to say, "We might be locked in, but we ain't buried yet." He'd been working on an appeal. Certain new evidence would set him free. When they carried his body out, wrapped in a thin white sheet, no one spoke. The sound of boots on concrete was the only thing that moved. The rain slipped through cracks in the ceiling, dripping onto the floor where Daniels used to stand every morning during count. Elias sat on his bunk, eyes fixed on the empty space where his friend's voice used to fill the air. "If Daniels gave up," he whispered, "what's left for the rest of us?" The lights flickered once, then went out completely. Darkness fell over the block like a shroud. The rows of cells stretched into the distance, endless and cold, each one holding a man who'd once believed in something. In that silence, Elias felt it, the truth no one dared to say out loud. Hope didn't die fast in San Quentin. It died slowly, piece by piece, until nothing was left but the sound of rain and the weight of waiting. And somewhere beyond the walls, the world kept turning, never once looking back. The morning after Daniel's death, the air inside San Quentin felt different, heavier, like grief had soaked into the concrete overnight. The guards moved slower, the inmates talked quieter, and even the sound of metal clanging against metal seemed dulled by the weight of what had happened. Elias didn't sleep. He couldn't. He sat up on his bunk all night. watching the faint blue glow of the hallway lights bleed through the bars. Daniel's death wasn't just another tragedy. It was a warning. In this place, hope was dangerous. By breakfast, rumors had taken shape. Some said Daniels had taken his own life. Others whispered it was something else, that he'd found something he shouldn't have. Elias tried not to listen, but when he saw the way the guards avoided eye contact, something inside him shifted. Daniels had been close to proving his innocence, just like Elias once tried. And now he was gone. Later that day, during yard time, the sky hung low and gray over the bay. The cold wind off the water carried the smell of salt and iron. Elias walked slow, his steps measured, his eyes scanning the crowd. The yard was a chessboard of unspoken rules, where you stood, who you nodded to, who you didn't. A man named Burke approached him. Older, quiet, always watching. Burke had been at San Quentin longer than most, and he knew things that didn't make it into reports. He didn't do it, Burke said without looking at him. Daniels? Elias asked. Burke nodded. Word is, he had something on the warden. Papers. Letters. They were gone when they found him. Elias froze. He didn't know whether to believe it. But deep down, it made sense. Daniels had been too close to getting out. Too loud about the truth. That night, Elias went back to his cell and pulled out a small, folded note Daniels had slipped under his door a week before his death. It only said 3 words. Check the files. He didn't know what it meant then, but now it felt like a map. The next morning, during his work shift in the file room, a job he'd earned after years of good behavior, Elias began to look. Old records, parole hearings, internal reports. It was all there, buried under years of dust. And then, tucked inside an old folder marked maintenance requests, he found something strange, letters signed by the warden himself, authorizing restricted inmate movements on nights no transfers were scheduled. He hid the papers beneath his shirt, heart pounding as he slipped them into his cell later that evening. Each word burned in his mind. He didn't know yet what they meant, but he could feel the danger of knowing too much. Over the next few days, the tension inside the block thickened. Guards were restless. Cells were searched twice a day. It felt like everyone was being watched. Elias started noticing a shadow that followed his every move. A guard named Jensen, tall, silent, with eyes that never blinked long. When Jensen stopped him one afternoon and said, "The warden wants to see you," Elias knew the walls were closing in. The office smelled like old coffee and leather. The warden sat behind a wooden desk, papers stacked neatly in front of him. "You've been here a long time, Monroe," the warden said calmly. "Kept your head down. That's good. But lately, I hear you've been curious." Elias didn't respond. The warden leaned forward. "Curiosity is a dangerous thing in here. It gets men hurt. You understand?" Elias nodded slowly. "Good," the warden said, smiling faintly. "Then we won't have any problems." When Elias left the office, he could feel eyes on him, from the hallway, the watchtower, maybe even the cameras he'd stopped believing worked years ago. That night, a piece of folded paper was slid under his cell door. He opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a single sentence, written in rough handwriting. "You're next." The lights flickered again, the way they always did before the currents surged to the lower block. He heard footsteps, then the sound of a door opening, then silence. In the quiet that followed, Elias sat on the edge of his bunk, clutching the papers he'd found. Daniels had died chasing the truth. Now it was his turn to finish what his friend started. But somewhere deep down, a question echoed in his mind, one he couldn't silence. What if the truth itself was what killed them both? And in that moment, as the prison sank into darkness once more, Elias realized he was no longer just surviving San Quentin. He was part of something far more dangerous, a secret buried beneath years of concrete, lies, and silence. The kind of secret that didn't let anyone walk away alive. The next few days in San Quentin felt like walking through a storm that hadn't yet broken. Every sound, every footstep, every clang of metal carried something behind it. The air had changed. Elias could feel it in his bones. He barely spoke, barely slept. Every night, he unfolded the crumpled papers he'd hidden beneath the thin mattress and read the same lines over and over. The warden's signature, the strange authorization codes, the list of inmate IDs. One of those IDs was Daniel's. Another, the one that stopped Elias's heart, was his own. He wasn't supposed to be on that list. Those names weren't random transfers. They were records of men who had vanished inside the walls, men no one asked about afterward. By morning, Elias made up his mind. If the truth was buried here, he was going to find it. He started with the file room again. The guards had grown suspicious, so he worked faster, memorizing where things were, which drawers creaked, which corners the cameras didn't reach. Late one evening, while cleaning near the far cabinet, he noticed something strange, a thin crack in the concrete wall behind the old file shelves. He tapped it. Hollow. The next day, he brought a small piece of sharpened metal he'd hidden from the workshop and began to chip away when the guards weren't looking. Beneath the concrete was a rusted vent cover. Behind it, a narrow tunnel ran deep into the darkness. It didn't make sense. This part of the prison wasn't supposed to have crawl spaces. But then again, nothing about San Quentin made sense anymore. That night, when the lights went out, Elias slipped through the vent. The air was cold and dry, and the sound of his breathing echoed against the narrow metal walls. After crawling for what felt like an hour, he found himself looking down into an abandoned maintenance corridor. It was lined with pipes and cables, and doors, unmarked doors. He dropped down quietly. His hands trembled as he opened the first one. Inside was an empty cell, but not a regular one. The walls were thicker, lined with soundproof padding. Chains hung from the ceiling. The bed was gone. The next door was the same, and the next, until he found the last room, the one that made his knees go weak. On the wall, someone had scratched words into the concrete. They never leave. He stepped closer. Underneath those words, he saw something faint but familiar, Daniel's handwriting. Elias stumbled back, his pulse pounding in his ears. The pieces began to fit together. The warden wasn't just hiding misconduct. He was hiding disappearances. Men like Daniel's who knew too much. Men who found what they weren't supposed to. Footsteps echoed from behind. A flashlight beam swept across the corridor. Elias froze. Monroe, a voice barked. It was Jensen, the guard who'd been watching him. You've gone too far this time. Elias ran. His heart hammered in his chest, every corner tighter than the last. He could hear Jensen's boots slamming on the metal floor, getting closer. Elias slipped through the vent again, scraping his arm against the jagged edge, pulling himself back into the cell just as the lights flicked on. When the guards came for inspection, they looked through his cell, but they didn't find anything. The papers were gone. Someone had already taken them. That night, Elias sat in darkness, staring at the vent. His hands still shook. The air smelled of rust and fear. He realized he wasn't the only one who knew about that tunnel. Someone else had been there before him, and someone had followed him back. Hours later, a voice came from the next cell. Soft, whispering. You saw it, didn't you? Elias turned. It was Burke. His face was hidden in the dark, but his tone was calm, almost knowing. They keep us quiet for a reason, Burke said. Those rooms, they ain't just for punishment. There were men disappear. Daniels found proof. And now, they're making sure you won't. Elias leaned closer. Why tell me this? Burke sighed. Because once you see what's real in this place, you can't unsee it. And you need to know, there's one more thing Daniels left behind. Something they haven't found yet. Elias's pulse quickened. Where? Burke hesitated, then said quietly, in the chapel. Before Elias could ask more, the night alarm blared. Red lights filled the block. Guards rushed in, shouting orders. Burke was pulled from his cell. As he disappeared down the hallway, Elias caught one last look at his face, calm, almost resigned. The noise faded, and the prison fell silent again. Elias lay awake until dawn, the words echoing in his mind like a haunting promise. In the chapel, that was where it all began, and where the truth waited, buried beneath the last place anyone would think to look. And as the first light of morning crept through the bars, Elias knew what he had to do next, even if it meant becoming the next name no one would ever remember. The chapel stood at the far end of the West Wing, the only part of San Quentin that still felt untouched by time. Morning sunlight filtered through stained glass, casting fractured colors on the cracked floor. The air smelled faintly of candle wax and damp wood. It was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that made Elias's heart race faster than footsteps ever could. He'd been watching the chapel for days. The guards barely paid attention to it. Most of them avoided it altogether. Only the old chaplain came by every evening, carrying his Bible and a ring of keys that jingled softly as he walked. Elias knew that if Daniels had hidden something, it would be where no one else dared to look, in the one place that pretended to be holy. That night, during the maintenance shift, Elias made his move. He slipped away under the noise of clanging metal and sweeping brooms, his hands trembling inside his worn gloves. The chapel doors creaked open with a moan, and a wave of cold air brushed against his face. Inside, the flickering candles along the altar cast long shadows across the pews. Dust floated in the light beams like slow-moving ghosts. Every step Elias took echoed, long, lonely sounds swallowed by silence. He scanned the room. The altar, the crucifix, the wooden confession booth. Everything seemed ordinary. But Daniels was not the kind of man who hid things in plain sight. Elias remembered what Burke had said, something they haven't found yet. He moved to the back wall, tracing the edges of the wooden panels. His fingers brushed against something rough, a loose board behind the altar. He pried it open, revealing a small, hollow space. Inside was a metal box, rusted at the corners and covered in dust. Elias lifted it out carefully and placed it on the altar. His breath caught as he opened it. Inside were old photographs, handwritten notes, and a small flash drive. The photos showed prisoners, men he recognized, including Daniels, standing in front of the same padded rooms he had found. In the background, one of the guards was smiling. Jensen. The notes were worse. Each one listed dates, initials, and what looked like coded reports. Transfers, reassignments, numbers that matched inmate IDs. Every page was a record of men who had disappeared without official notice. And then he saw it, one final document. A letter written in Daniel's handwriting. If you're reading this, it means I didn't make it. They run this place from the inside. Not just guards, not just the warden. It's bigger. San Quentin isn't a prison anymore. It's an experiment. And they're watching us. Elias's hands shook as he read the last line. Find the basement beneath the chapel. That's where the truth lives. Before he could react, he heard it, the unmistakable sound of boots on tile. Slow, deliberate. He turned toward the door. The chaplain stood there, his silhouette framed by the dim light. But something was off. The kindness that used to live in the man's eyes was gone. In its place was something hollow. You shouldn't be here, son, the chaplain said quietly. Not tonight. Elias froze. His pulse thundered in his ears. The chaplain stepped closer, the keys in his hand glinting in the light. Daniels thought he could save himself with truth, he said, voice calm, almost pitying. But truth doesn't set you free here. It buries you deeper. The floor creaked behind Elias. Another shadow moved. Jensen. Elias grabbed the flash drive and ran. He darted toward the side exit, the box clattering to the ground. Hands reached out, voices shouted his name. He threw himself through the door and into the corridor, sprinting through the narrow hallways lit only by the red emergency lights. He didn't stop until he reached the old laundry chute near Block C, the one that led to the drainage tunnels below the prison. He jumped in, sliding down into darkness as shouts echoed above. When he finally hit the bottom, cold water splashed against his face. He gasped, clutching the flash drive like his life depended on it, because it did. Somewhere above, the chapel bell began to toll, slow, heavy, like the heartbeat of the prison itself. Elias looked up into the shadows and whispered to himself, I know what you're hiding now. The echo of his words disappeared into the tunnels. The water rippled around him, dark and endless. And for the first time since entering San Quentin, Elias realized that truth was no longer his way out. It was his only way to survive. The air beneath San Quentin was heavy, thick with rot, rust, and something else Elias couldn't name. Every drip of water echoed like a heartbeat. The tunnels were old, built decades before the modern blocks above them. They were meant for maintenance, but now they looked like something else, a graveyard for forgotten things. Elias waded through ankle-deep water, his flashlight flickering. The beams sliced through the darkness, catching glimpses of old pipes, torn cables, and walls marked with strange stains. Rats scurried past his boots. Somewhere behind him, he thought he heard the echo of footsteps, but it was hard to tell if it was real or just the tunnel playing tricks. He stopped to catch his breath. His hands still clutched the flash drive, his only proof that Daniels hadn't been paranoid. He pulled it from his pocket and stared at it. A small red label was peeling off the side. Written in faded ink were two words, Project Halo. He didn't know what that meant, but something inside him said it was the reason men had vanished. He kept walking until he reached a rusted gate. Beyond it, a faint light glowed. Elias used a broken wrench from the floor to pry it open. The metal screamed in protest, echoing down the tunnel. He froze, listening. No sound came back. Inside the room beyond the gate, the light flickered from an old generator still barely running. Tables were lined with folders, wires, and outdated monitors covered in dust. The walls were filled with charts and diagrams, all stamped with the same insignia: California Department of Corrections, Special Research Division. Elias stepped closer. The papers on the table were labeled with inmate numbers, hundreds of them. Each one listed behavioral notes, medical procedures, and psychological evaluations. But one file made his blood run cold. It had his name on it. He opened it. The first page was a photo, him, taken the day he arrived. Below it were notes describing his habits, reactions, and even conversations he'd had with Burke, Jensen, and Daniels. It wasn't random. They'd been monitoring him since day one. A sound broke the silence, a metallic click. He spun around. A projector on the wall flickered to life on its own. The static faded, replaced by grainy black and white footage. It showed men sitting in small rooms, strapped to chairs. Electrodes attached to their temples. Some of them were screaming, some completely still. On the corner of the screen, a timestamp read 1998. The camera shifted. It showed Daniels. He was speaking to someone off-screen, voice trembling but determined. They said it was therapy, Daniels said. They said it was meant to calm the violent ones. But they lied. They're breaking minds to build obedience. The footage glitched. A voice, cold and mechanical, interrupted. Project Halo, Phase 3 complete. Subject response, compliant. Then static. Elias stood frozen, heart hammering. Every instinct told him to destroy the place. But something deeper told him he needed to know more. He went through more files, opening one marked J. Burke. It was dated 5 years ago. The report said memory reconstruction, successful. It hit him like a punch. Burke wasn't just another inmate. He was one of them, a failed subject. That's why he always remembered things he shouldn't, why he knew about the hidden rooms, why he warned Elias. The realization came too late. He heard a sound behind him, a low hum, like an electric current building. The lights flickered, then brightened, flooding the room in blinding white. He shielded his eyes. From the shadows at the far end of the corridor, a door opened. 3 figures stepped in, guards, but not in normal uniforms. Their badges bore the same insignia from the documents. Their faces were blank, emotionless. Elias backed away, but there was nowhere to run. One of them raised a small device. It looked like a tranquilizer gun. Elias Carter, the guard said flatly. You've seen too much. Before Elias could answer, the lights cut out. A deafening boom echoed through the tunnel. Sparks rained from the ceiling. Then, silence. When the emergency lights flickered back on, the guards were gone. The door they'd entered through now stood wide open. A faint wind blew through it, carrying the scent of burned plastic and ozone. Elias stepped through cautiously. The corridor led deeper underground, steeper, colder. Along the walls, he saw etched words and old carvings from inmates long forgotten. Messages like, "They watch through the vents," and "Don't sleep when it hums." He didn't know where it led, but he knew it was the same place Daniels had written about, beneath the chapel. The deeper he went, the more the air seemed to vibrate. The hum grew louder. His flashlight dimmed. And then, at the end of the tunnel, he saw it. A massive steel door with a biometric scanner beside it. On the door, painted in red, were 2 words that made his skin crawl. Observation wing. He reached out to touch the scanner. It flickered, scanning his face. A green light blinked once. The door hissed and began to open. Elias stepped back, heart pounding, as a wall of cold, sterile air rushed out. Inside, rows of glass chambers lined the room, filled with liquid and faint silhouettes floating within. He took a trembling step forward. His reflection rippled on the glass of the nearest tank, and behind it, a face slowly turned toward him. It was his own. For a moment, Elias couldn't breathe. His reflection stared back at him, but it wasn't a reflection anymore. The figure behind the glass had his face, his scars, even the faint burn on his right hand. It floated lifelessly in pale fluid, tubes attached to its head and chest, like something caught between life and death. He stumbled backward, heart racing. His mind screamed that it couldn't be real, that maybe the stress, the fear, and the sleepless nights had finally broken him. But when he looked around the room, he saw dozens more chambers just like it. Each one held a human shape, each tagged with a number and a name. Some names he recognized, inmates who had vanished years ago without explanation. The hum of the machines filled the silence. Every few seconds, one of the tanks released a soft hiss, like the sound of breathing. On a nearby control panel, the screens flickered with data: subject neural activity, minimal; phase retention, unstable. Elias forced himself closer, reading the tags. One name made his blood run cold. Jonathan Burke, Phase 2 subject. His friend, the one who'd warned him, was in one of the tanks, his eyes half open but empty. He gripped the side of the chamber, trembling. "They didn't kill you," he whispered. "They erased you." As he stared, fragments of conversation came back. Burke talking about voices, Daniel's panic about the chapel, the strange hum at night. It all fit now. The prison wasn't just a place for punishment. It was an experiment, one designed to break minds, erase memories, and rebuild obedience. He turned to the main control desk. A folder sat on top labeled Project Halo, Final Report. Inside were pages filled with notes, signatures, and official seals. The last entry read, "Subjects exhibit full compliance and controlled emotional response. Neural suppression effective at 83% capacity. Recommendation: expand trials to statewide facilities." Elias dropped the folder, his hands shaking. It wasn't just San Quentin. There were others. He knew what he had to do. He reached for the flash drive in his pocket, the one Daniels had given him, and found a console with a working USB port. He plugged it in, the screen lighting up with a download bar. Transferring data, 12%, 25%. A sudden alarm blared through the chamber. Red lights began to flash. The tanks started to bubble, their contents stirring violently. One by one, the figures inside began to twitch, their hands pressing faintly against the glass from the inside. Elias backed away, whispering to himself, "No, no, no." The control panel blinked. Containment breach detected. A loud crack echoed as one of the tanks fractured. Another shattered completely, spraying liquid across the floor. The figure inside, the one that looked exactly like Elias, collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air like it had been underwater for years. It raised its head slowly. Its eyes were dull, confused, but alive. It looked right at him. Elias froze. He couldn't tell if it was begging for help or something else. He stepped closer, but the alarm grew louder, and the lights began to die out one by one. The clone, or whatever it was, whispered something he could barely hear over the noise. "They're still watching." Then the lights went out completely. When Elias came to, he was lying on the cold floor outside the chapel. The morning sun filtered through the cracked glass windows, cutting long streaks of gold across the dust. The alarms were silent now. The prison was quiet, too quiet. He stood slowly, his head throbbing. His clothes were soaked, his shoes leaving wet prints on the old marble floor. There was no sign of the underground facility, no doors, no tunnels. Only the chapel as it had always been. For a moment, he wondered if it had all been a dream. But then he felt something hard in his pocket, the flash drive. He looked around one last time, the empty pews stretching before him. On the altar, a single candle burned, flickering weakly in the morning breeze. Elias walked out into the prison yard. The sky was pale blue, the air heavy with that familiar smell of rust and ocean salt. Guards moved about, shouting orders, but none of them looked at him. None of them even seemed to notice he was there. He walked past the cell blocks, past the watchtower, past everything he'd known for years. The gates stood open, something that never happened. He stepped outside, his heart pounding, waiting for someone to call his name, to stop him. No one did. As he crossed the last line of shadow from the gate, a voice echoed faintly from a loudspeaker inside the prison, an automated message repeating in a monotone. "Project Halo, reset cycle initiated." The gates slammed shut behind him. Elias didn't look back. He just walked toward the rising sun, clutching the flash drive like a lifeline. Somewhere behind those concrete walls, the hum began again. And in the glass chambers beneath San Quentin, a new pair of eyes opened, identical to his.